everybody, welcome back to English 229. This is for our class for Monday the 19th. And as you know, on Wednesday we had a Moodle outage. Actually, it was a power outage at GCC that would have impacted Moodle and all of the other electronic services at GCC. So classes were canceled, and I expect you probably were not able to access our class, though I try to post our classes the night beforehand, which I did, but since you weren't able to access class on Wednesday, I gave an extension on our discussion question until our next class, which would be Monday the 19th. And hopefully now the Moodle and power issues have been settled at GCC. So where we left off is we were talking about Stephen King and H.P. Lovecraft and some of their definitions about Gothic and horror. And now we actually get to read our first text in the Gothic tradition. Very famous text, Frankenstein. Iconic text, even. And I have included the Gutenberg link to that in the event that you don't have access to a hard copy. And I wanted to introduce Frankenstein. We've got 2 weeks basically devoted to Frankenstein. And at the ending of our Frankenstein unit, I'm going to be asking you for a journal response, which would be approximately a page or so of thoughts or reflections or questions, because sometimes the questions are a lot more interesting than the answers, about Frankenstein. And certainly you can hand in your journals early if you'd like, but I'm deliberately having your journals be due at the ending of each of the units that we are discussing so that you could utilize the information from the class videos and from the class discussion forum as well. So that won't be due until the 28th, which is Wednesday, and that'll be due at 11:59 p.m. And I ask that you send that to me via PDF to my email address, ruiz@gcc.mass.edu, because that's what works best with my grading program. And what I will be doing is evaluating it informally on a checkmark system, and basically I view it as a kind of conversation on paper. So I'm not evaluating it for grammar or mechanics. In fact, you could even just hand in bullet points if you so wanted to. Now, obviously, the journal responses, which are informal, would be very different than what we would be doing for formal academic papers, which we will be discussing as the semester progresses. So in terms of Frankenstein, and I have given you a few hints about how to read that particular novel, Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein, is the daughter of the very famous Mary Wollstonecraft, an early feminist. And I think that that is embedded within the text. I think I mentioned that I talk about Frankenstein in my Women in Literature class, written by a female author at a time where female authors were not necessarily published. That said, we have a very male-centric text. So talking about that dichotomy is quite interesting. We also know that Mary Shelley was the wife of Percy Shelley, the great romantic poet, and that he had quite a hand with the editorial process of the novel. So much so that some have even speculated that, or suggested, that perhaps Mary Shelley isn't or shouldn't be given complete credit for writing her work because of Percy Shelley's hand. I've always thought that that argument was a bit sexist, because I think if it had happened the other way around, if we had a male author who had a female editor, those questions wouldn't have even been raised about authorship. And if nothing else, I think that we can all agree that all professional authors go through multiple editorial processes, so that wouldn't be unusual at all. Now, this piece straddles the Gothic tradition, and we've developed some of the criteria associated with the Gothic tradition, as well as science fiction. You'll remember that we had talked about how science fiction is something that is possible. It just has not been yet invented with the science of our time, as opposed to Gothic fiction or supernatural literature, which is that which defies natural or scientific explanation. And as I suggested, this is also a feminist text, even though it may not seem to be on the surface. Now, the 1930s Universal version of Frankenstein has become part of our popular culture, and that's probably what most people think of with Frankenstein. In fact, I had even indicated last class that most people assume that Frankenstein is the name of the creature. No, Frankenstein is the name of the creator. Notice that I use the term creature rather than monster because Mary Shelley gives us a text that very much is sympathetic and empathetic towards the creature. The true monster is the creator and also humanity as a whole that rejects this. And even though this is less obvious in the 1930s version of the film, we can see that Boris Karloff, who played the creature, gave us a rather sympathetic portrayal. And the way that this story came about was through a ghost story competition, where basically Mary Shelley was vacationing with friends and Percy Shelley, and they were experiencing some inclement weather, so they created a ghost story competition to amuse themselves. And that night, Mary Shelley had a nightmare. It was about the very famous creation scene that most people think of when they think of Frankenstein. She created a story around that. Her husband, again, Percy read the story, suggested that she needed to add and develop details. So she's added length. Much of what you will find in the novel as you're reading the novel are long descriptions of nature and the natural world, which would have been very common during the time period for the Romantic poets. And particularly, it's thought that those are the passages that Percy Shelley helped her to expand and develop. I would argue that they do more than just expand and develop the novel, that they also serve a central function for our understanding the text as well, which we will talk about. But of course, the 1930s version that we have of Frankenstein, the film version, condenses all of that, as well as doesn't offer us the subplots that we've become accustomed to when we're reading the novel. That what we've got is an epistolary novel. It's told in a series of letters, and that we are introduced to a character named Walton. And it's quite easy to forget that once Walton begins telling us about Victor Frankenstein's story, that ultimately we never hear from Victor Frankenstein directly. The only character we hear from is Robert Walton in the novel, which also complicates the narration that we will talk about. But I wanted to focus more on the 1930s film at this point rather than the novel, because I suspect you're probably in various stages of reading. I was hopeful that by the time we got to Frankenstein that you could have finished it, the text in its entirety, but I had indicated that I'm also well aware that the ideal is not always possible. So I thought that what we could do today is to watch that very iconic 1930s Hollywood film. You may have seen it before, but what I found with my students is that as the years have progressed, fewer and fewer students have actually seen that film, although they have some knowledge of the film. But even if you have seen the film, I want you to watch it from a different perspective now that you are engaged with the novel itself. And the film is very different from the story that Mary Shelley presents to us in the novel. It's something that English teachers usually caution you about, that the film adaptations are going to be quite different. But in this instance, I view them as almost two separate entities. The film version being one story and the Mary Shelley version being another story. And I think both of them are important in terms of the Gothic tradition, considering the importance of film with our knowledge of Gothic. So again, I wanted you to watch this film version. It's an hour and 10 minutes. Now, initially when this film version came out, and this was in 1931, it was without a soundtrack. So I unfortunately was not able to find a free version online without the soundtrack. I was able to find a version with the soundtrack on Vimeo. So if you wanted to watch the film version with the soundtrack for free, you can watch the link that I've included below in the section 1 about Frankenstein. However, if you are a purist and you wanted to see Frankenstein without the soundtrack, then unfortunately I don't have a free link to share with you. However, you can find a link on Amazon Prime, you can find a link on YouTube, and also on other venues as well if you wanted to rent or even purchase the film. But In terms of our reading, I thought we could talk a little bit about the film next class and then to begin to discuss the novel until the 28th, which is when our first journal would be due. And then we will transition into Edgar Allan Poe and his short stories before we begin our next text, which happens to be Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So for our attendance question today, I wanted to keep things short so that you had time to watch the film. And that'll be due on the 21st, Wednesday at 8 a.m. But again, if you need additional time, please let me know and I'll be happy to grant you an extension. The attendance question is, did you like or dislike the 1930s film version of Frankenstein and why? And again, there is no right or wrong answer to this question. I'm more interested in your thought process. And while you're not required to respond to your classmates, I certainly encourage you to respond to your classmates, much like you might respond in a class discussion if we were having a live class. But I do require that you read your classmates' responses so that you would get a sense of what it is we would have discussed in class. And I respond to all of your responses, so I ask that you read those responses as well. So I leave you to watch the film Frankenstein. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next class discussing Mary Shelley's text. Take care. Bye-bye.